He thought he knew her. The way her smile lit up the room, the way her laughter felt like home. It all seemed so real. But behind that perfect smile was a secret that would shatter his world. Daniel Carter, a tech mogul at the top of his game, is about to discover the betrayal that cuts deeper than any rival could. What happens when trust turns into a weapon? Stay with me. You won't believe where this story leads. The gentle hum of the city filtered through the glass walls of Daniel Carter's penthouse. From his perch atop Silicon Valley skyline, the view was spectacular. Towering skyscrapers glittering in the golden hues of dusk, a fitting reflection of his achievements. Yet for Daniel, it all seemed oddly hollow. Success was no stranger to him. It had been his constant companion for nearly a decade. But tonight, it was Amanda Hayes who filled the silence, her laughter drifting from the kitchen as she prepared their evening cocktail. Amanda was radiant, a vision of effortless beauty in a sleek black dress that clung to her frame. Her every move exuded charm, a magnetic allure that captured the attention of anyone in her orbit. For Daniel, she wasn't just his girlfriend. She was a testament to everything he thought he'd wanted. A partner who was as dazzling in public as she was comforting in private. At least, that's what he told himself. "Aren't you going to join me, Daniel?" Amanda's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She leaned against the counter, a glass of wine in hand, her lips curving into the kind of smile that made him forget the grueling hours spent building his empire. "Of course," he replied, crossing the room to meet her. They were a striking couple, often described as the embodiment of modern power and elegance. Amanda, a celebrated influencer, knew how to captivate an audience. With millions of followers hanging on her every word, she effortlessly complemented Daniel's reserved brilliance. Together, they were a media darling, a pairing that felt too perfect to falter. But as they clinked glasses and Amanda spoke animatedly about an upcoming gala, Daniel's mind wandered. There was something about her enthusiasm that felt practiced. He dismissed the thought quickly, brushing it off as the weariness of a long week. After all, Amanda had been nothing but supportive, hadn't she? Still, a shadow of doubt lingered. Days later, at a high-profile networking event, the couple was once again at the center of attention. Daniel stood near the edge of the crowd, scanning the room with practiced precision. While he preferred to operate behind the scenes, Amanda thrived in the limelight, weaving effortlessly through the throng of executives and celebrities. "She's a natural," a colleague commented, nodding toward Amanda. "You're lucky to have someone who understands the importance of image." Daniel smiled politely, but said nothing. His focus shifted to Amanda as she laughed with a group of investors, her posture relaxed yet poised. She was every bit the woman he had fallen for, confident, intelligent, and endlessly charismatic. But as the night wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the sense that she was performing, each interaction carefully curated for maximum effect. The thought nagged at him, but once again he buried it. Why question something that seemed so perfect? Later that evening, back in the quiet of their penthouse, Amanda curled up beside him on the couch. The city lights twinkled outside, casting a warm glow over the room. "You've been quiet tonight," she said softly, running a hand through his hair. "Everything okay?" "Just work," he lied, forcing a smile. Amanda's eyes searched his, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel thought he saw something fleeting, like a crack in the perfect image she so carefully maintained. But then her smile returned, as radiant as ever, and the moment passed. As Daniel drifted off to sleep that night, his dreams were restless. For all the wealth, success, and adoration surrounding him, there was a nagging feeling he couldn't quite name. And somewhere in the darkness, the cracks began to form. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the glow of the city lights flickering in the reflection of his wine glass. Amanda's laughter echoed faintly in his ears, but his mind wasn't in the present. It was drifting back to their beginning, to the moment their paths first crossed. It had been at a technology summit in San Francisco, a gathering of the brightest minds and wealthiest players in the industry. Daniel had been invited to deliver the keynote, a role he neither sought nor particularly enjoyed. His preference had always been to work in silence, letting his innovation speak louder than his words. Yet that night, as he stepped off the stage to polite applause, Amanda Hayes had been waiting. "You're Daniel Carter," she'd said, her tone a perfect blend of intrigue and admiration. "And you are?" he'd replied, trying to hide his discomfort with small talk. "Amanda Hayes." She introduced herself with a smile that lit up the room. Content creator, digital storyteller, and apparently a tech enthusiast tonight. Her candor caught him off guard. Most people approached him with a polished facade, careful to say the right things to gain his attention. But Amanda seemed refreshingly unfiltered, her curiosity genuine. "I'm not sure what part of a keynote on cybersecurity qualifies as storytelling," Daniel remarked, the corner of his mouth twitching in the faintest smile. "Everything is a story," she countered. "Even algorithms. Especially algorithms. You just have to know how to tell it." Their conversation had flowed effortlessly after that. Amanda's wit and enthusiasm were infectious, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel found himself lowering his guard. By the end of the evening, they'd exchanged numbers, and Amanda had promised to show him how to humanize his groundbreaking ideas. The memories unfurled like a film reel in Daniel's mind as he stared out over the city. Their first few dates had been equally magnetic. Amanda's world of social media and constant attention was a stark contrast to Daniel's methodical and private existence, yet they complemented each other in ways he hadn't thought possible. He recalled a particular evening when Amanda had invited him to one of her influencer events. The venue was a modern art gallery, the walls lined with avant-garde installations that Amanda navigated with ease. "This piece," she'd said, gesturing to a chaotic swirl of colors on canvas, "reminds me of you." "Chaotic and loud?" Daniel teased, raising an eyebrow. "No," Amanda replied, laughing. "Complex and brilliant. There's so much happening beneath the surface. Layers most people won't take the time to understand. But those who do, they see the genius." Her words had stayed with him. For someone who thrived in the superficiality of social media, Amanda had a surprising depth that made Daniel believe she saw the real him. But now, as Daniel sat alone in the penthouse, the weight of those moments pressed against his chest. He couldn't deny that their relationship had begun with a spark, one that had felt genuine and unforced. Amanda had been his escape from the cold precision of his world, a burst of warmth and unpredictability. And yet, as the present crept back into focus, so did the cracks in his perception. He remembered the gala from earlier that week, the calculated way Amanda had worked the room. Was her interest in him ever as genuine as it seemed? Or had her charm been another carefully curated story, designed to captivate not just an audience, but him as well? The thought was unbearable, yet Daniel couldn't shake it. He drained the rest of his wine and set the glass down with more force than he intended. The city below him glittered like the promises Amanda once made, dazzling but distant and perhaps just as fleeting. The soft morning light seeped into the penthouse as Daniel sipped his coffee, the faint aroma of Amanda's favorite vanilla candles lingering in the air. She was already up, humming a tune as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen, a ritual she had insisted on maintaining despite their busy schedules. It was one of the many little things he'd come to appreciate about her. But this morning, as Daniel watched her move with practiced ease, something about her felt distant. "Anything exciting today?" Amanda asked, her back turned to him as she plated a perfectly arranged spread of eggs, toast, and fruit. "Meetings," Daniel replied, distracted. He set his cup down, the clink against the marble countertop, louder than he intended. "What about you? Still prepping for the gala?" "Always," she said lightly, turning to flash him a smile. "You know how demanding these events can be." Her tone was casual, but Daniel caught a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, brief, but enough to make him pause. As Amanda set the plates down and joined him, Daniel forced a smile, though his thoughts were elsewhere. She seemed so composed, so polished, yet that flicker lingered in his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. Later that day, Daniel immersed himself in work, but the doubts lingered, threading through his thoughts like static interference. It wasn't until late afternoon that a message notification broke his concentration. It was from Amanda, running late. "Don't wait up for dinner. Love you." The simplicity of her words shouldn't have bothered him, but something about them felt off. It wasn't unusual for Amanda to have last-minute commitments, yet Daniel couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't about another influencer event or brand collaboration. He decided to push the thought aside, telling himself he was overanalyzing. Yet, as the hours passed, her absence weighed on him. By the time midnight rolled around, Daniel was seated on the couch, flipping aimlessly through channels, waiting for the sound of the elevator. When Amanda finally walked in, her heels clicking softly against the floor, Daniel looked up. She seemed perfectly composed, her makeup flawless, her smile as radiant as ever. "Long day?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "Exhausting," Amanda replied, setting her bag down. "But productive. You wouldn't believe how much planning goes into these galas." Daniel nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. There was no obvious reason to doubt her, yet the words felt rehearsed, her expression just a little too perfect. The following days brought more of the same. Amanda's schedule grew busier, filled with meetings and networking that kept her away late into the night. Daniel wanted to believe her, to trust the woman he had once been so sure of. But every time she spoke, he felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing against him. It wasn't just her late nights. There were other, subtler things, like the way she avoided leaving her phone unattended or how her laughter sometimes sounded hollow. One evening, as they prepared for yet another public event, Daniel caught himself watching her in the mirror. Amanda stood before him, fixing her earrings with practiced grace, her reflection radiating the charm that had once captivated him. But as their eyes met in the glass, Daniel saw it again, that flicker of something beneath the surface, a crack in the flawless veneer. "Is something wrong?" Amanda asked, her tone light but probing. "No," Daniel replied quickly, though the unease gnawed at him. "Just thinking about the week ahead." She smiled and turned back to the mirror, but Daniel wasn't sure who she was smiling for, himself or the carefully curated image she seemed so desperate to maintain. That night, as Amanda fell asleep beside him, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The doubts were no longer whispers. They were a chorus, growing louder with every passing day. He wanted to confront her, to ask the questions that burned in his mind. But a part of him hesitated, afraid of what the answers might reveal. In the silence of the darkened room, Daniel realized something had shifted. The foundation of trust he'd built with Amanda was cracking, and he didn't know how to stop it. Daniel's office buzzed with activity, the hum of conversation blending with the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. Yet, despite the usual vibrancy, a tension hung in the air. His assistant, Mia, knocked softly on his glass door before stepping in. "We need to talk about the Raven Tech contract," she began, her tone measured but urgent. Daniel set his coffee down and gestured for her to continue. The Raven Tech deal was one of the company's most significant partnerships, a multi-million-dollar agreement that had taken months to secure. "They're pulling back," Mia said, citing concerns about leaked data. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Leaked data? That's impossible. We have protocols in place. I've already asked IT to investigate, but Daniel, this isn't the first time we've had issues flagged in the past month." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. Daniel prided himself on running a tight ship, every project meticulously planned, every risk mitigated. But the cracks were showing, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. "Bring me the full report," he said, his voice firmer now. As Mia left, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline. This wasn't just a hiccup. It was a sign of something larger, and the timing couldn't have been worse. That evening, Daniel convened a meeting with his senior leadership team. The room was filled with familiar faces, but his gaze kept drifting toward one, Mark Evans, his longtime business partner. Mark had always been sharp, ambitious, and at times overly aggressive in his pursuit of growth. Lately, Daniel had noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, distractions during meetings, a reluctance to share details about key projects. As the discussion unfolded, Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What are you implying?" Mark asked, his tone defensive, after Daniel pressed him about the leaked data. "I'm not implying anything," Daniel replied, his calm exterior masking the storm brewing inside. "But we need to find the source of these issues, and that starts with transparency." Mark nodded, but the tension between them lingered long after the meeting ended. The stress of the day followed Daniel home, where he found Amanda lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Long day?" she asked, setting her phone aside. "Very," Daniel admitted, loosening his tie as he sat down beside her. He wanted to confide in her, to share the growing weight on his shoulders. But something held him back. Amanda had always been supportive, or at least she had appeared to be. Yet lately, even her presence felt strained. "You'll figure it out," Amanda said lightly, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "You always do." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the unease in his chest. Did she mean them, or was it just another layer of her polished persona? The following days brought more problems. Contracts were delayed, investors grew restless, and the Raven Tech situation remained unresolved. Daniel buried himself in work, determined to fix things, but the cracks in his company seemed to mirror those in his personal life. He found himself scrutinizing every interaction, both at work and at home. Mark's evasiveness, Amanda's late nights, the sense that something was slipping through his fingers. It was all connected, he was sure of it, but the threads were tangled, and pulling one risked unraveling everything. Late one night, as Daniel pored over reports in his office, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Amanda. "Out with some friends. Don't wait up." Daniel stared at the screen, the words blurring together. He wanted to believe her, to trust that everything was fine. But trust was becoming a fragile thing, eroded by too many unanswered questions. The lavish gala unfolded in a sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos, the air buzzing with polite laughter and the clinking of champagne flutes. Daniel stood near the edge of the room, watching as Amanda moved effortlessly through the crowd, her sequin dress catching the light with every step. She was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone she passed. Her smile was flawless, her laughter perfectly timed, and her words tailored to charm. If Daniel hadn't known her so intimately, he might have been convinced she was exactly what she appeared to be, a confident, supportive partner who elevated him in every way. But tonight, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts. The way her smile faltered when she thought no one was looking, the almost imperceptible hesitation in her movements as she caught his gaze from across the room. There was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. As Amanda approached him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, Daniel forced himself to return her smile. "Enjoying yourself?" she asked, her tone warm but rehearsed. "Of course," Daniel replied. His voice was steady, but the knot in his stomach tightened. "You seem to be the star of the evening." Amanda laughed, a sound that was as much a performance as the gala itself. "You know how these things are. Networking is everything." As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself in conversation with a small group of investors. They spoke about market trends and the challenges of staying ahead in the tech industry, but Daniel's focus kept drifting to Amanda. She was engaged in a lively discussion with a man Daniel didn't recognize, her posture relaxed and her laughter genuine, for the first time all night. "Your girlfriend is quite the presence," one of the investors remarked, following Daniel's gaze. "She's always been good with people," Daniel replied, his tone neutral. The investor chuckled. "More than good. She's a natural at this. You're lucky to have someone who can navigate these circles so well." Daniel nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Lucky, that word echoed in his mind, leaving a bitter taste. Later, as they drove home, The silence between them was heavy. Amanda scrolled through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. "Did you have a good time?" Daniel asked, breaking the quiet. "Of course," Amanda said, not looking up. "It was a great opportunity to connect with some new people." Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I noticed you spent a lot of time with that man. Who was he?" Amanda finally looked up, her expression calm but guarded. "Just someone interested in one of my campaigns." "It's nothing, really." Her words were casual, but Daniel caught the faint edge in her tone. He didn't press further, though the unease in his chest grew. The days following the gala only deepened Daniel's doubts. Amanda's schedule became even busier, her explanations for late nights and missed dinners increasingly vague. Yet in public, she remained the picture of perfection, a devoted partner who stood proudly by his side. One evening, Daniel came across a video Amanda had posted on her social media. In it, she gushed about her incredible relationship with Daniel, emphasizing how supportive and understanding he was. Her followers flooded the comments with admiration, calling them a power couple and relationship goals. But as Daniel watched the video, he felt a strange detachment. The words Amanda spoke were flattering, even heartfelt, but they didn't feel real. They felt scripted, crafted for an audience that only saw the surface. As Amanda arrived home late that night, Daniel was waiting for her in the living room. She greeted him with a quick kiss on the cheek before heading to the kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "How was your day?" she called out, her voice light. "Long," Daniel replied, standing in the doorway. "Yours?" "Exhausting," Amanda said with a sigh, "but productive." Daniel studied her as she poured herself a glass of water, her movements as graceful as ever. But beneath the surface, he sensed an undercurrent of tension. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly. Amanda paused, turning to face him. "Tired of what?" "Keeping up appearances," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. For a moment, Amanda didn't respond. Then she smiled, a soft, almost sad smile. "It's part of the job, Daniel. You of all people should understand that." Daniel nodded, though the answer did little to ease his doubts. As Amanda retreated to the bedroom, he remained in the living room, staring out at the city lights. The image of her smile lingered in his mind, but it wasn't the warm, genuine expression he remembered from their early days. It was something else entirely, something hollow, like the glittering facade of the city below. The morning light barely filtered through the penthouse blinds as Daniel stared at his untouched coffee. Across the kitchen, Amanda moved with her usual grace, humming softly as she scrolled through her phone. Her ease only amplified the unease gnawing at him. "Big plans today?" she asked, her tone casual, as if nothing were amiss. "Meetings," Daniel replied flatly. "What about you?" Amanda shrugged. "Same. Calls, some campaign planning, maybe dinner with a few people from the gala." The mention of the gala stirred something sharp in Daniel's chest. He nodded but said nothing, the words he wanted to ask catching in his throat. Amanda's smile lingered as she kissed his cheek and left for the day, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and a suffocating silence. Hours later, Daniel sat at his office desk, staring at his phone. The doubts that had simmered in his mind were now impossible to ignore. He thought of the gala, the late nights, the hollow reassurances. He thought of Mark, evasive and defensive, and Amanda's ever-growing schedule of meetings. Finally, he dialed a number, his heart pounding as it rang. "Mr. Carter." A crisp voice answered on the third ring. "This is Anthony Waters. How can I assist you?" Anthony Waters was a discreet private investigator who came highly recommended by a trusted colleague. Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need someone to look into a situation," he said carefully. "It's sensitive." Anthony's response was calm and professional. "I understand. Why don't we start with the basics? What exactly are you looking for?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the phone. "I need to know if someone close to me is being honest. If there's anything I should be aware of, the meeting with Anthony later that day was brief but thorough. They discussed Amanda's schedule, her connections, and the changes in her behavior that had set off Daniel's suspicions. "I'll be discreet," Anthony assured him as they wrapped up. "You will hear from me as soon as I have anything concrete." As Daniel left the investigator's office, a wave of guilt washed over him. Hiring someone to investigate Amanda felt like a betrayal in itself, but the thought of doing nothing, of continuing to live in uncertainty, was unbearable. Days passed with little change. Amanda remained her polished, composed self, gliding through their shared life as if nothing were wrong. She was attentive when it suited her, affectionate in public, and increasingly elusive in private. "You've been quiet lately," Amanda remarked one evening as they shared a late dinner. "Just work," Daniel replied, the words now a familiar refrain. Amanda nodded, her expression unreadable. "Well, don't overdo it. You're no good to anyone burned out." The irony of her words stung, but Daniel bit back a response. He couldn't afford to confront her, not yet. Finally, the call came. Daniel stepped out of a meeting to answer, his pulse quickening as he heard Anthony's voice. "I've started to gather some information," Anthony began. "It's still early, but there are a few things you should know." Daniel leaned against the wall, his grip on the phone tightening. "Go on." "There's been contact with someone you might recognize, Mark Evans. They've met several times over the past few weeks, usually in places that wouldn't draw much attention. I'm digging into the nature of these meetings, but it's unusual." Mark. The name hit Daniel like a blow. His business partner, the man he'd trusted for years, meeting with Amanda in secret? What else? Daniel asked, his voice tight. "I'll need more time to get specifics," Anthony said. "But I'd advise you to tread carefully. Something about this doesn't feel right." Daniel thanked him and ended the call, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, betrayal, and confusion. That evening, as Amanda arrived home, she greeted him with the same radiant smile she always wore. Daniel watched her carefully, searching for cracks in her facade, for any sign that she might sense his growing awareness. "Everything okay?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied him. "Just tired," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. Amanda nodded and kissed his cheek before disappearing into the bedroom. Daniel remained in the living room, staring at the city lights outside. The doubt that had once been a whisper was now a roar, and the name Mark Evans echoed in his mind like a warning bell. The air in Daniel's penthouse felt heavier than usual as he scrolled through the email Anthony had sent earlier that evening. The attachment contained a series of photographs, each one sharper and more damning than the last. Amanda, smiling as she met with Mark Evans at an upscale cafe. Amanda, seated across from him in a private booth, leaning in as if sharing something confidential. Amanda, exiting the building alone, her expression unreadable. Daniel stared at the images, his jaw tight. The familiar faces and mundane settings betrayed the weight of what they represented. Every frame seemed to chip away at the foundation of trust he'd built, not just with Amanda, but with Mark. "What are you hiding?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible in the empty room. The next day, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual, his mind racing with questions. Mark's behavior in recent weeks now took on a new significance, and Daniel was determined to uncover the truth. He called Mia into his office, her presence a welcome contrast to the tension hanging over him. "I need you to pull any reports involving Mark's accounts for the last 3 months, Daniel said, his tone clipped but calm. Mia blinked, surprised by the sudden request. "Of course, but is everything okay?" "Just a routine review," Daniel lied. "I want to make sure everything's aligned." Mia nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe him. "I'll have it on your desk by noon." As she left, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he stared at the city skyline. He didn't want to believe Mark could betray him, but the evidence was beginning to tell a different story. Later that afternoon, as Daniel reviewed the reports Mia had compiled, another email from Anthony arrived. This one contained a brief summary of Amanda's activities over the past week. Amanda met with Mark 3 times, each meeting lasting approximately an hour. Locations varied but were consistently discreet. Conversations appear amicable, though the content remains unknown. Surveillance continues. The words blurred together as Daniel read them again and again. The meetings were no longer a coincidence. They were a pattern. That evening, as Amanda walked into the penthouse, Daniel found himself studying her every move. She greeted him with her usual warmth, her smile radiant as she recounted the day's events. "Anything interesting happen at work?" she asked, her tone light, as she poured herself a glass of wine. Daniel hesitated, his gaze fixed on her. "Just the usual," he replied carefully. Amanda nodded, taking a sip of her drink before settling onto the couch. She looked relaxed, but Daniel couldn't shake the sense that her calm was deliberate. Another piece of the carefully curated image she presented to the world. "You've been quiet lately," Amanda said, glancing at him over the rim of her glass. "Just a lot on my mind," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Amanda smiled, her expression unreadable. "Well, don't let it get to you. You're brilliant, Daniel. Whatever it is, you'll figure it out." Her words, once comforting, now felt hollow. As the night wore on, Daniel retreated to his home office. The photographs from Anthony spread across his desk. The sight of Amanda and Mark together made his chest tighten, anger and betrayal twisting in his gut. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted to understand why. Why would Amanda risk everything they had built together? Why would Mark, his partner, his friend, turn against him? The questions swirled in his mind as he stared out at the city lights, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't confront them, not yet. He needed more. In the days that followed, Daniel continued to piece together the fragments of the truth. He buried himself in work, his interactions with Amanda carefully measured, his conversations with Mark even more so. During a meeting with Mark, Daniel forced himself to remain composed, even as his business partner discussed upcoming projects with practiced ease. "Everything's on track," Mark said confidently. "The team's been working overtime to make sure we hit our targets." Daniel nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He studied Mark's face, searching for any sign of guilt, any crack in his polished exterior. But Mark was as smooth as ever, his charm intact, his demeanor unshaken. As the meeting ended, Daniel lingered, watching as Mark gathered his things and left the room. The sense of betrayal gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't act on it, at least not yet. That evening, as Amanda sat beside him on the couch, scrolling through her phone, Daniel felt the weight of their shared silence. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the timing wasn't right. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes, his mind racing with plans. The cracks in their relationship were widening, and soon there would be no way to hide them. The mornings had grown quieter between Daniel and Amanda. Their once effortless conversations now felt forced, punctuated by silences that neither dared to address. Daniel sat at the breakfast table, his eyes skimming over a report from work, though he wasn't absorbing a single word. Amanda moved through the kitchen, preparing her tea with practiced grace. "Another busy day ahead?" she asked, her tone light as she leaned against the counter. "Always," Daniel replied, barely looking up. He hesitated before adding, "What about you?" Amanda paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of her cup. "Meetings, campaign prep. You know how it is." The answer was routine, but Daniel noted the way her voice lacked its usual confidence. For the first time, he sensed that Amanda might be aware of the distance growing between them. At the office, Daniel's unease followed him like a shadow. He reviewed Anthony's latest report, which offered no new revelations, but confirmed that Amanda and Mark were still meeting regularly. The knowledge gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of the deception unfolding around him. During a break, Daniel found himself scrolling through Amanda's social media. Her latest post, a glowing endorsement of a luxury brand, had garnered thousands of likes and comments. The caption was polished, her smile radiant, but Daniel felt none of the warmth those images were meant to convey. Instead, it felt like a facade, one that had begun to crack under the weight of her secrets. A message notification interrupted his thoughts. It was from Mia, who had compiled additional data on Mark's recent activities. As Daniel skimmed through the documents, patterns began to emerge. Financial irregularities, discrepancies in project timelines, and unexplained delays that coincided with Amanda's meetings with Mark. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one Daniel didn't want to see. That evening, Amanda arrived home later than usual. Daniel was seated in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand, as he watched the city lights flicker outside. She hesitated in the doorway, her smile faltering when their eyes met. "You're still up?" she asked, setting her bag down. Daniel nodded, gesturing toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit. Let's talk." Amanda's expression shifted, a flicker of apprehension quickly masked by a practiced smile. She sat down, crossing her legs as she leaned back. "What's on your mind?" Daniel studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "You've been busy lately." She laughed lightly, though the sound lacked its usual ease. "You know how it is. Work never really stops." "I do," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "But I also know when something feels off." Amanda's smile tightened. "What are you saying, Daniel?" "I'm saying we're not in sync anymore," he replied. "And I can't ignore the feeling that you're not telling me everything." For a brief moment, Amanda's mask slipped. Her eyes darted away, her posture stiffening. But she recovered quickly, her voice steady as she said, "You're overthinking, Daniel. It's just work stress, yours and mine. We'll get through it." Daniel wanted to believe her, to accept the reassurance she offered. But the weight of the evidence he'd seen was too heavy to ignore. He nodded, ending the conversation, but the tension between them lingered like a storm waiting to break. Over the next few days, Amanda seemed to grow more cautious. She double-checked her phone before setting it down, her conversations more guarded. Daniel noticed the shift, recognizing it as a sign that she sensed his growing distrust. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Amanda approached him hesitantly. "I feel like we're drifting," she said softly. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "Do you?" She nodded, her eyes searching his. "I don't know what's changed, but I can feel it. You've been distant, distracted." Daniel hesitated, torn between confronting her and continuing to gather evidence. "Maybe it's just everything piling up," he said finally. "Work, commitments, it's a lot." Amanda nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. "We need to work on this, Daniel. I don't want to lose what we have." Her words were sincere, or at least they seemed to be. But Daniel couldn't ignore the voice in his head, telling him that her concern was as calculated as the rest of her persona. As Amanda drifted off to sleep that night, Daniel remained awake, his mind racing. Her attempt to address the growing tension between them felt like both an admission and a deflection. He knew he was getting closer to the truth, but with every step forward, the stakes grew higher. The mask Amanda wore was cracking, but Daniel wasn't sure how much longer he could hold himself back from tearing it off completely. The email notification blinked on Daniel's screen as he sat in his office, the soft hum of his computer the only sound in the room. His heart pounded as he opened the message from Anthony Waters. The subject line was simple, yet it carried the weight of everything he had been dreading. "New findings urgent." The attached file contained photos, timestamps, and a written summary. Daniel's eyes scanned the images first, his chest tightening with every click. Amanda and Mark were seated together in a private dining room, their expressions serious. In another photo, Amanda handed Mark a folder, her gaze cautious as she glanced around. Anthony's report confirmed what Daniel had feared but hadn't wanted to believe. Amanda and Mark had been conspiring for weeks, possibly months. The contents of their conversations weren't fully clear yet, but the frequency of their meetings and the exchange of documents painted a damning picture. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the screen. A cold, bitter anger surged through him, not just at Amanda and Mark, but at himself, for trusting them, for letting this betrayal creep into his life. Later that evening, Daniel sat in the penthouse, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Amanda arrived home, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she set her bag down and greeted him with a quick kiss. "You're home early," she remarked, her tone light as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Finish what I needed to do," Daniel replied, his voice calm but distant. He watched her carefully, noting the slight hesitation in her movements. Amanda sat across from him, her smile as radiant as ever. "How was your day?" "Productive," Daniel said, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "How about yours? Any interesting meetings?" Amanda froze for the briefest moment before answering. "Just the usual," she said smoothly. "Planning campaigns, connecting with brands, nothing exciting." Her response was so polished, so effortless, that it made Daniel's anger simmer just beneath the surface. But he forced himself to remain composed. That night, as Amanda slept beside him, Daniel couldn't rest. He replayed Anthony's findings over and over in his mind, each piece of evidence solidifying the betrayal he had tried so hard to deny. The next morning, Daniel called Anthony, his voice steady but cold. "I need you to find out everything, down to the smallest detail. Leave no stone unturned." "Understood," Anthony replied. "I'll keep you updated." As Daniel ended the call, he stared out at the city skyline, his reflection barely visible in the glass. The weight of what was coming bore down on him, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He had to see this through, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Daniel maintained a facade of normalcy, even as his internal world unraveled. At work, he kept his interactions with Mark professional, though every conversation felt like a test of his restraint. "You seem distracted lately," Mark remarked one afternoon as they reviewed a project. "Just a lot on my plate," Daniel replied curtly. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. "Well, let me know if there's anything I can do to help." The irony of the statement made Daniel's stomach churn, but he forced himself to nod. "I will." Back at home, Amanda's behavior seemed almost too perfect, as if she sensed Daniel's growing distance but couldn't pinpoint its cause. She laughed at his jokes, asked about his day, and filled the silence with stories of her own. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Amanda rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "I feel like we haven't had much time for each other lately," she said softly. Daniel tensed but forced himself to respond calmly. "Things have been busy." Amanda tilted her head to look at him. "Maybe we should plan a weekend away. Just the two of us. It might help us reconnect." The suggestion caught Daniel off guard, and for a moment, he considered agreeing. But the thought of pretending everything was fine while knowing the truth made his chest tighten. "Maybe," he said noncommittally. Amanda smiled, but Daniel noticed the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Later that night, Daniel received another call from Anthony. The investigator's voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "I've uncovered more details," Anthony began. "It's worse than we thought. There's evidence that Mark has been diverting funds, and Amanda may have helped him access confidential files from your company. It's not just personal, it's professional." Daniel gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. "Send me everything." "I'll forward the details immediately," Anthony said. "But, Daniel, I have to ask, what are you planning to do?" Daniel was silent for a moment before replying. "I don't know yet, but whatever it is, it won't be quiet." As he ended the call, Daniel sat in the darkness of his office, the weight of Anthony's words sinking in. The betrayal had reached every corner of his life, leaving no part untouched. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The confrontation he had been avoiding was now inevitable, and the thought of it made his chest ache. But more than that, it made his resolve harden. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about reclaiming control. The next morning, Daniel sat in his office, the city skyline stretching before him like an endless sea of possibilities. Possibilities he once believed were within his control. Now, those beliefs felt like illusions, shattered by the weight of betrayal. The evidence from Anthony sat in a neatly organized folder on his desk, every page a testament to Amanda and Mark's duplicity. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he replayed the events of the past months. Amanda's radiant smile, Mark's easy confidence, the countless moments that now felt like carefully constructed lies. The ache in his chest was no longer a dull throb. It was a sharp, unrelenting pain that demanded action. He opened the folder again, his eyes scanning the details Anthony had uncovered. Transactions marked as miscellaneous expenses tied to accounts Amanda had access to. Emails between Mark and external vendors, subtly rerouting contracts to third parties. And then, the most damning piece, a file Amanda had shared with Mark containing sensitive financial projections for Daniel's company. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated, deliberate, and professional. That evening, Daniel found himself in the penthouse, staring at the city lights as Amanda breezed through the door. She greeted him with her usual warmth, setting her bag down before walking over to kiss him on the cheek. "Hey," she said softly, "you look tired." "Long day," Daniel replied, his tone neutral. Amanda nodded, her smile faint. "I was thinking, how about dinner at that new place downtown tomorrow? It could be a nice change of pace." Daniel forced a smile. "We'll see." As Amanda disappeared into the bedroom, Daniel remained in the living room, gripping the glass of scotch in his hand. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the moment never felt right. Or perhaps he wasn't ready to face the full weight of her lies. The following day, Daniel met with Mia in his office. She placed a stack of reports on his desk, her expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "I noticed some discrepancies in Mark's accounts," Mia began carefully. "They're subtle, but they're there." Daniel nodded. "I've seen them too." Mia hesitated before continuing. "Do you think it's intentional?" "I don't think," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I know." Mia's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't press further. Instead, she asked, "What's the plan?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the reports. "For now, we wait. But I want everything documented. Every detail, every transaction. Make sure it's airtight." Mia nodded, her determination matching his. "Understood." That night, Daniel sat alone in his office at home, the quiet hum of the city his only company. He thought about the life he had built, the trust he had given so freely to Amanda and Mark, and how effortlessly they had betrayed it. His mind drifted to the first time he had met Mark, their partnership born out of mutual respect and shared ambition. Mark had been a steady presence, someone Daniel relied on in both good times and bad. To discover that trust had been weaponized against him felt like a knife twisting in his gut. And then there was Amanda. She had been his light, the one who brought warmth and spontaneity to his otherwise structured world. Her laughter, her touch, her words, all of it now felt tainted by the knowledge of her deceit. Daniel closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He had spent weeks piecing together the truth, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the one who had betrayed him. But the time for reconciliation was over. The next morning, Daniel received another call from Anthony. "I've found more," the investigator began. "It's conclusive now. Amanda and Mark have been working together to divert funds and manipulate your business deals. Amanda was instrumental in giving Mark access to your internal systems." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What else?" "There's also communication suggesting they were planning to present their own proposal to one of your major investors, cutting you out entirely," Anthony continued. "It's clear they've been coordinating for a while." Daniel's chest tightened as the weight of the betrayal fully settled. "Send me everything." "You'll have it within the hour," Anthony replied. As Daniel ended the call, he sat in silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. He had everything he needed now, the truth laid bare in undeniable detail. But knowing the truth and acting on it were two different things. That evening, as Amanda joined him for dinner, Daniel felt the tension between them like a third presence in the room. She chatted about her day, her words light and casual, but Daniel barely heard her. "Are you okay?" Amanda asked, her voice tinged with concern. Daniel met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The cracks in their relationship had become chasms, and the weight of her betrayal was suffocating. He knew the time for confrontation was near, but for now, he needed to gather his strength. As Amanda reached across the table to touch his hand, Daniel felt a surge of anger beneath his calm exterior. The woman sitting before him wasn't who he thought she was, and the man he once was, trusting, open, no longer existed. The truth had changed everything. The evening was unusually still, the silence in the penthouse broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Amanda sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the screen. Daniel stood by the window, staring out at the city lights but not really seeing them. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his chest, but there was no turning back. "Do you want a drink?" Amanda asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Daniel turned, his gaze steady as he walked toward her. "No," he said simply. Amanda tilted her head, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Something on your mind?" Daniel sat down across from her, his movements deliberate. "We need to talk." Amanda's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She set her phone down and leaned back, crossing her legs with practiced ease. "About what?" Daniel held her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "About you and Mark." For a moment, Amanda didn't move. Her carefully composed demeanor faltered, the mask she wore slipping just enough for Daniel to see the flicker of fear beneath. "What about Mark?" she asked, her tone cautious. Daniel leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. "I know about the meetings, the documents you've shared, the accounts you've accessed." Amanda's breath hitched, but she quickly recovered, shaking her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel reached for the folder on the coffee table, flipping it open and sliding the contents toward her. Photos, emails, financial records, every piece of evidence Anthony had uncovered. "Don't insult me, Amanda," he said, his voice cold. "This isn't speculation. This is fact." Amanda stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up one of the photos. This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice shaky. "Then tell me," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "Tell me what it is, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and Mark have been conspiring behind my back. Personally, professionally. So go ahead, explain it." Amanda's face hardened, her fear giving way to defiance. "You don't understand," she said, setting the photo down. "It's not what you think." "Then make me understand," Daniel demanded, his patience wearing thin. Amanda stood, pacing the room as she struggled to find the words. "Mark approached me months ago," she began. "He said he needed help with some adjustments to the company's finances. He made it sound harmless, like it was just a temporary fix." "And you believed him?" Daniel asked, incredulous. Amanda stopped pacing, turning to face him. "I didn't have a choice. He said it would affect you, that if I didn't help, the company could lose millions. I was trying to protect you, Daniel." Daniel laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the tension. "Protect me? By stealing from me? By lying to me? I didn't know it would go this far." Amanda shot back, her voice rising. "I thought it was just one thing, but then Mark kept asking for more and I didn't know how to stop it." "You stop it by telling the truth," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "But instead, you chose to keep going, to betray me." Amanda's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her. "I made a mistake," she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I got in over my head, and I didn't know how to fix it." Daniel stood, his anger barely contained. "You didn't make a mistake, Amanda. You made a choice. Over and over again, you chose to lie to me, to help Mark, to risk everything I built." Amanda took a step toward him, her eyes pleading. "I love you, Daniel. I never meant to hurt you." Daniel shook his head, his expression hard. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't lying and stealing and covering your tracks. Love is loyalty, honesty, trust, and you've destroyed all of that." The silence between them was deafening as Amanda stood frozen, her tears falling freely now. Daniel turned away, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. "I need you to leave," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. Amanda's breath hitched. "Daniel, please." "Leave," he repeated, his tone unyielding. "Pack your things and go. I can't do this anymore." Amanda hesitated, her hands trembling as she realized there was no room for negotiation. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the bedroom, her footsteps heavy with the weight of her choices. As the door clicked shut behind her, Daniel sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The confrontation had left him drained, his emotions raw and unguarded. For weeks, he had been preparing for this moment, but now that it had passed, all he felt was an empty, aching void. The woman he had loved, the partner he had trusted, was gone. And with her departure, Daniel was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by betrayal. The air in Daniel's office felt heavier than usual as he sat behind his desk, reviewing the evidence for the 100th time. The folder Anthony had provided now included a timeline of Mark's activities, a detailed map of his deceit. For years, Daniel had trusted Mark like a brother, believing him to be a steadfast partner in both vision and execution. Now, that trust had turned to ash. Mia entered quietly, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "I've compiled everything you asked for," she said, placing another folder on his desk. "It's clear, Daniel. Mark's been siphoning money for months, and with Amanda's help, it's bad." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mia. Has the legal team been briefed?" "They're ready whenever you are," she replied. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Set the meeting for tomorrow morning. It's time to end this." The next day, Mark walked into the conference room with his usual swagger, his confident smile aimed at the board members already seated around the table. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but cold. "Good morning, everyone," Mark began, sliding into a chair. "What's on the agenda?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Mark's. "You are." Mark froze, his smile faltering. "Excuse me." Daniel motioned to Mia, who distributed copies of the evidence to everyone at the table. The room fell silent as the board members began to read, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. "This is a detailed account of your activities over the past year," Daniel said, his voice steady. "The financial discrepancies, the diverted contracts, the unauthorized access to confidential files. It's all here, Mark." Mark's face turned pale as he glanced at the documents. "Daniel, this has to be a mistake," he stammered. "You know I'd never—" "Don't," Daniel interrupted, his tone sharp. "Don't insult me or this board with more lies. We trusted you, Mark. I trusted you. And you used that trust to line your pockets and undermine this company." The room grew tense as the weight of Daniel's words settled over the table. Mark's usual bravado was gone, replaced by a nervous desperation. "I can explain," Mark began, his voice shaky. "It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like." Daniel cut him off. He gestured to the documents in front of the board members. "The evidence is irrefutable, and the damage you've done goes beyond money. You jeopardized our reputation, our partnerships, and the livelihoods of everyone who works here." Mark looked around the room, searching for support, but the faces staring back at him were unforgiving. "Daniel, please," he said, his voice dropping to a plea. "We can work this out. I'll fix it. Just give me a chance." Daniel's gaze hardened. "You had your chance, Mark, and you chose greed over loyalty. There's no coming back from this." By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously voted to terminate Mark's employment and begin legal proceedings against him. As Mark was escorted out of the building, his shoulders slumped and his face ashen, Daniel watched from the window of his office. The sight should have brought him satisfaction, but all he felt was exhaustion. The man he had once considered a friend was gone, replaced by someone Daniel could no longer recognize. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the penthouse, a glass of scotch in his hand as he stared at the city lights. Amanda's absence was palpable, her belongings already cleared from the space they had once shared. And now, Mark was gone too, leaving Daniel to pick up the pieces of what they had broken. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a message from Mia. "Legal team is filing the paperwork. Everything's under control." Daniel replied with a simple thank you before setting the phone down. He had spent years building his company, pouring his heart and soul into its success. And now, with the betrayal laid bare and the guilty parties removed, he was left to rebuild, not just the company, but himself. As the night wore on, Daniel allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the man he had been before Amanda and Mark, someone who believed in trust, loyalty, and the strength of partnerships. That man was gone, replaced by someone more guarded, more skeptical. But Daniel knew that he couldn't let their betrayal define him. He had a company to protect, employees who depended on him, and a future that demanded his focus. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Daniel was determined to reclaim everything he had lost, and more. The office hummed with quiet determination as Daniel walked through the main floor, his presence commanding yet understated. Employees glanced up briefly, offering polite nods before returning to their work. The atmosphere had shifted since Mark's departure, a mixture of unease and relief that reflected the company's resilience despite the betrayal. In the weeks following Mark's removal, Daniel had worked tirelessly to stabilize the business. The legal team had finalized the necessary filings, partnerships were being renegotiated, and internal systems had undergone rigorous audits to prevent future breaches. Still, the damage lingered like a shadow over every decision he made. Mia entered his office with a stack of documents, her expression a blend of efficiency and encouragement. "I've compiled the latest reports on the Raven Tech deal," she said, setting the papers on his desk. Daniel nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "How bad is it?" "Not as bad as we expected," she replied. "They've expressed concerns about the recent turmoil, but they're still willing to negotiate. They just need reassurance that the company's leadership is stable." Daniel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Good. Let's prioritize this. Schedule a meeting with their team by the end of the week." "Already done," Mia said with a small smile. Daniel offered her a rare smile in return. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd survive," Mia replied lightly, "but it'd be a lot messier." That evening, Daniel hosted a meeting with key department heads in the executive conference room. The team had been shaken by Mark's betrayal, but Daniel's steady leadership had begun to restore their confidence. "I want to thank all of you for your hard work during this transition," Daniel began, his tone measured but warm. "We've faced challenges before, and we'll face them again. But what matters is how we respond. And you've all risen to the occasion." The team exchanged nods, their expressions a mix of determination and gratitude. "Our focus now is on rebuilding trust with our partners and streamlining internal operations," Daniel continued. "We've made progress, but there's still work to be done, and I know we're capable of doing it together." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose, the energy in the room a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated the company weeks earlier. As Daniel drove home that night, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the progress they had made so far was undeniable. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for the company, but for himself. When he arrived at the penthouse, the space felt emptier than ever. Amanda's absence was a void he hadn't yet learned to navigate, her belongings long gone but her memory lingering in the details she had once touched. The vase she had chosen for the coffee table, the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the couch. It was all a reminder of what had been lost. But tonight, Daniel didn't dwell on the past. Instead, he poured himself a drink and opened his laptop, reviewing the next steps for the Raven Tech negotiation. Work had become his anchor, the one thing that remained steady in the aftermath of betrayal. The following day, Daniel met with Anthony Waters, the investigator whose meticulous work had unraveled Mark's and Amanda's schemes. The two sat in a quiet cafe, a stark contrast to the chaos that had dominated their earlier conversations. "I just wanted to thank you again," Daniel said, his voice sincere. "You uncovered everything I needed to move forward." Anthony nodded. "It's my job, but I appreciate that. How are things now?" "Better," Daniel admitted. "The company's stabilizing, and the team's rallying behind the changes we've implemented. But personally, it's still a process." Anthony offered a small, understanding smile. "That's normal. Betrayal on that level takes time to heal. Just remember, it's okay to lean on the people you trust." Daniel nodded, the words resonating more than he expected. "Thanks, Anthony." As they parted ways, Daniel felt a sense of closure. The chapter involving Mark and Amanda was ending, and while the wounds were still fresh, they no longer defined him. That night, Daniel returned to the penthouse and stood by the window, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. He thought about Mia's unwavering support, the team's resilience, and Anthony's advice. Leaning on others wasn't something that came easily to him. His success had been built on self-reliance, on trusting his instincts above all else. But the past few weeks had taught him an invaluable lesson. Even the strongest foundations need reinforcement. As he sipped his drink, Daniel allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of pride. He had survived the storm, and while there was still work to be done, he knew he was capable of facing whatever came next. The road to rebuilding was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt ready to take the next step. Amanda sat in the quiet of her new apartment, a modest space compared to the luxury she had once shared with Daniel. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of the city outside a constant reminder of how much her life had changed. She stared at her phone, scrolling through the comments on her latest post, a carefully curated photo meant to project confidence. But the comments told a different story. What happened to Daniel? No updates from the penthouse anymore. Trouble in paradise. Fake life, fake love. We all see through it now. Amanda's hand tightened around the phone, her chest tightening with anger and shame. She had always prided herself on controlling the narrative, presenting a flawless image to her followers. But now, the cracks were impossible to hide. She tossed the phone onto the coffee table and sank back into the couch, her mind racing. Losing Daniel had been devastating, but it wasn't just the relationship she mourned. It was the life they had built together, the stability, the security, the prestige. And now, even her career as an influencer felt fragile, the whispers of her betrayal beginning to spread through the industry. The next morning, Amanda met with a potential brand partner at a trendy cafe downtown. She had arrived early, dressed impeccably in a tailored outfit that exuded professionalism and charm. But as the meeting unfolded, she could feel the distance in the representative's tone, the polite but pointed questions about her current situation. "We're just concerned about the optics," the representative said carefully, offering a tight smile. "Your audience engagement has dipped recently, and there's been chatter." Amanda forced a laugh, her voice steady despite the sting of the words. "Every influencer goes through phases like this. My audience is as loyal as ever, and I have a big campaign launching soon that will turn everything around." The representative nodded but didn't look convinced. "We'll keep that in mind. For now, let's revisit this partnership in a few months." As the representative left, Amanda sat alone at the table, her coffee untouched. The rejection was another blow, a reminder of how far she had fallen. Later that day, Amanda met with Mark at a quiet bar. His appearance was disheveled, his confidence replaced by a nervous energy that mirrored her own. "This is a mess," Mark said, taking a sip of his drink. "Daniel's got the board and the legal team breathing down my neck. It's only a matter of time before they come after everything I've got." Amanda folded her arms, her gaze icy. "You think I'm not dealing with fallout too? My reputation is in shambles, Mark. No one wants to work with me anymore because of you." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Because of me? Don't act like you're innocent in all this. You were more than willing to go along with the plan when it suited you." Amanda leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. "I didn't agree to lose everything. This wasn't part of the deal." Mark shook his head, his frustration evident. "The deal's over, Amanda. It's every man or woman for themselves now." The bitterness in his tone made Amanda's stomach churn. She had thought of Mark as an ally, someone who understood the stakes as well as she did. But now, sitting across from him, she realized they were nothing more than co-conspirators caught in the same sinking ship. That evening, Amanda returned to her apartment and poured herself a glass of wine, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her. She thought about Daniel, about the life they had shared, and the choices that had led her to this point. In her heart, she had always known the risk she was taking, but she had convinced herself that she could manage it, that Daniel would never discover the truth, and that the rewards would outweigh the consequences. Now, as she sat alone in the dimly lit room, the reality of her choices was impossible to ignore. She had gambled everything: her relationship, her career, her reputation, and lost. Amanda picked up her phone and opened her messaging app, hesitating for a moment before typing a message to Daniel. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. For everything." She stared at the words for a long moment before hitting send, her heart pounding as the message delivered. She didn't expect a response, and she wasn't sure she deserved one. But for the first time in weeks, Amanda allowed herself to feel the full weight of her guilt. The message sat unread on Daniel's phone as he worked late into the night, the buzz of incoming notifications drowned out by the steady rhythm of his focus. Amanda's apology, sincere as it may have been, was a distant echo in a life now consumed by rebuilding. The conference room buzzed with quiet energy as Daniel entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. The team had gathered to finalize negotiations with Raventech, a deal that represented both a crucial victory and a statement of resilience. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table, nodding to Mia as she began distributing updated documents. "Thank you all for being here," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "We've faced challenges these past months, but we've come through stronger. This deal isn't just about numbers. It's about showing the world that we're back on track." The executives exchanged nods, their confidence buoyed by Daniel's leadership. He had spent weeks rebuilding trust within the company, addressing concerns with transparency and decisiveness. Now, as they prepared to close the deal, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. As the Raventech representatives entered, Daniel stood to greet them, his handshake firm and his expression professional. The negotiations were intense but respectful, both sides working toward a mutual goal. By the time the contracts were signed, the room erupted in a ripple of applause. "Congratulations, everyone," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "This is just the beginning." Later that evening, Daniel sat with Mia in his office, the glow of the city's skyline casting soft shadows across the room. She handed him a glass of whiskey, a rare moment of celebration between the two. "You did it," Mia said, her tone light but sincere. "We did it," Daniel corrected, raising his glass in a small toast. Mia smiled. "It's good to see you like this again. Focused, determined. It's been a rough few months, but you've handled it better than most people would." Daniel took a sip of his drink, his gaze thoughtful. "I've had a lot of help. From you, from the team. It's been a collective effort." "Well, Mia said with a grin. "You're the one steering the ship. Just don't forget to take a break once in a while." Daniel chuckled, though he knew there was truth in her words. The weight of recent events had left little room for rest, but the victories, small as they sometimes felt, were beginning to add up. The next day, Daniel visited the company's headquarters, spending time with employees on the ground floor. It was something he hadn't done in years, his focus often tied to high-level strategy. But now, more than ever, he understood the importance of connection. Walking through the open-plan office, Daniel stopped to speak with teams, listening to their ideas and addressing their concerns. The conversations were candid and uplifting, a reminder of the people who depended on his leadership. "You've been more present lately," one employee said, her tone appreciative. "It makes a difference, knowing you're here with us." Daniel nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I'm here because I believe in what we're building together." That evening, Daniel returned to the penthouse, the space feeling less like a reminder of what he had lost and more like a reflection of what he was rebuilding. He poured himself a drink and sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed on the table, a text from Mia. "Just checking in. You're doing great. Don't forget that." Daniel smiled faintly, typing a quick reply before setting the phone down. The people around him, Mia, his team, even the employees he had spoken to earlier, had become a source of strength. They reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight, that rebuilding wasn't just about numbers and contracts. It was about people. As the night deepened, Daniel allowed himself a moment of reflection. The past few months had tested him in ways he never anticipated, forcing him to confront betrayal, loss, and uncertainty. But through it all, he had discovered a resilience he didn't know he possessed. He wasn't the same man who had blindly trusted Amanda and Mark. He was sharper, more deliberate, and, despite everything, still hopeful. The path ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, Daniel felt prepared to walk it. With a deep breath, he raised his glass in a quiet toast to himself and the journey ahead. The soft hum of the elevator filled the silence as Daniel ascended to the rooftop of his company's headquarters. It was late, the building mostly empty, but he found solace in the quiet. As the doors opened, he stepped into the crisp night air, the city sprawling before him in a tapestry of lights and movement. This had always been his favorite spot, a place where he could think without interruption. Tonight, however, it wasn't work that occupied his mind. For the first time in weeks, his thoughts wandered toward the idea of what might come next, not for the company, but for himself. He leaned against the railing, the cool metal grounding him as he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The betrayal, the anger, the rebuilding. It had all been necessary, but it had also left scars. Still, there was a strange sense of clarity in those scars, a reminder of his resilience. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office to find Mia waiting with a cup of coffee and an agenda in hand. She greeted him with her usual efficiency, but there was a hint of something lighter in her tone. "Good morning," she said, handing him the coffee. "You're in early." "Couldn't sleep," Daniel admitted, taking a sip. "Well, you'll be glad to know the Raven Tech deal is moving smoothly, and the team is already prepping for the Investor Summit next month," Mia said as they walked his office. "Good," Daniel replied. "Let's keep the momentum going." Mia hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You know, you've been different lately. In a good way." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "More present," she said. "It's like you're not just focused on the company anymore. You're focused on the people." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I finally realized what really matters." Later that day, Daniel found himself drawn to the design floor, a place he rarely visited. The team there was deep into brainstorming for a new product line, their enthusiasm infectious as they shared ideas and sketches. One designer, a young woman named Kara, caught his attention as she presented a prototype. Her passion was evident in every word, her excitement palpable as she explained the concept. "This is potential," Daniel said, surprising both Kara and the rest of the team. Let's refine it and see if we can have a full proposal ready by the summit. Kara beamed, her confidence bolstered by Daniel's encouragement. Thank you, Mr. Carter. I won't let you down. As Daniel left the design floor, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Moments like these reminded him why he had started this company in the first place, not just to innovate, but to inspire. That evening, Daniel attended a networking event, something he had avoided in recent months. The room was filled with familiar faces, but it wasn't the usual business discussions that captured his attention. Instead, he found himself in a conversation with a woman named Evelyn, a consultant who specialized in organizational development. Their conversation began with industry trends, but quickly shifted to more personal topics. Evelyn's insights were sharp, her perspective refreshing, as she spoke about the importance of balance in leadership. You can't pour from an empty cup, she said with a smile. Even the best leaders need to take care of themselves. Daniel nodded, her words resonating more than he expected. That's something I'm still learning, he admitted. Well, it sounds like you're on the right track, Evelyn replied. As the evening continued, their conversation lingered in Daniel's mind. It wasn't often that he connected with someone on such a genuine level, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of possibility. When Daniel returned home that night, the penthouse felt different. It was still quiet, still spacious, but the emptiness no longer weighed on him. Instead, it felt like a blank slate, a canvas waiting to be filled. He sat by the window, the city lights stretching endlessly before him, and thought about Evelyn's words. Balance. It was something he had neglected for years, focusing so intently on success that he had forgotten to truly live. But now, as he stared out at the city, Daniel felt a quiet determination. The betrayal he had endured had tested him, but it had also taught him. He was stronger, sharper, and more aware of what he wanted and what he didn't. For the first time, the future felt less like a burden and more like an opportunity. Amanda paced her small apartment, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The message she had sent Daniel weeks ago remained unread, the weight of his silence pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had told herself not to expect a response, but the lack of acknowledgement stung more than she wanted to admit. She had spent the past month trying to piece her life back together, but progress was slow. The one steady stream of brand deals and sponsorships had dried up, her reputation tarnished by whispers of betrayal and dishonesty. Amanda had always known how to command attention, how to control the narrative, but now, the story wasn't hers to tell. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Mark. "We need to talk." Amanda's stomach twisted. The last time she had spoken to Mark, their conversation had ended in accusations and bitterness. She debated ignoring the message, but ultimately decided to respond. "What do you want?" The reply came almost instantly. "Meet me at the usual place. Tonight." Amanda sighed, her exhaustion mounting. She wasn't sure how much more Mark's schemes she could endure, but she knew she had to face him one last time. Later that evening, Amanda arrived at the dimly lit bar where she and Mark had often met to discuss their plans. He was already there, nursing a drink and looking more disheveled than ever. "You're late," he said, his tone sharp. "I almost didn't come," Amanda replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the only one dealing with fallout, Amanda. Daniel's legal team is coming after me with everything they've got, and I'm barely holding it together." Amanda crossed her arms. "What do you expect me to do about it?" "I've lost everything too, Mark. My career, my reputation, it's all gone." Mark scoffed, taking another sip of his drink. "You think this is bad? Try having your accounts frozen and lawyers breathing down your neck." Amanda's jaw tightened. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you dragged me into this mess." Mark's laughter was bitter. "Dragged you? You were more than willing, Amanda. Don't act like you're innocent now." The accusation hung in the air, the weight of their choices pressing down on both of them. As the conversation continued, Amanda realized something she hadn't before. Mark was unraveling. The confidence and charisma that had once made him so convincing were gone, replaced by desperation and paranoia. "You're on your own, Mark," Amanda said finally, her voice steady. "I'm done with this." Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't just walk away." "Watch me," Amanda replied, standing up. As she left the bar, a strange sense of relief washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she was reclaiming some semblance of control. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Amanda received an unexpected call from a former colleague in the influencer industry. The woman's tone was cautious but kind, offering Amanda a small opportunity to collaborate on a charity campaign. "It's not a big project," the colleague explained, "but it's a chance to rebuild." Amanda hesitated, her pride warring with her desperation. In the end, she agreed, knowing she couldn't afford to turn down any opportunity. As she hung up the phone, Amanda felt a flicker of hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was a path nonetheless. Meanwhile, Daniel was in his office, reviewing the latest progress reports with Mia. The company was thriving, the chaos of recent months now a distant memory. "You seem lighter these days," Mia remarked as she set a folder on his desk. Daniel looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe I am." Mia nodded, her expression warm. "It suits you." As Mia left, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his smile fading as he saw Amanda's name. The notification was from weeks ago, the message still unread. For a moment, he considered opening it, curiosity tugging at the edges of his resolve. But then he set the phone down, the decision clear in his mind. Amanda was no longer part of his story. That evening, Daniel stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. The air was crisp, the quiet a welcome reprieve. He thought about the past few months, the pain, the betrayal, the rebuilding, and felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. Amanda and Mark were behind him now, their choices a reminder of lessons learned. But as he looked toward the future, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The soft hum of conversation filled the conference room as Daniel sat at the head of the table, a quiet sense of pride settling over him. The team was wrapping up their quarterly review, the numbers reflecting a company not just recovering but thriving. "Fantastic work, everyone," Daniel said as the meeting concluded. "This wouldn't have been possible without your dedication and resilience. Let's keep this momentum going." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel exchanged nods with the department heads as they filed out. When the room was empty, he leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The chaos of the past months felt distant now, replaced by a steady confidence in the company's future. Later that afternoon, Mia joined Daniel in his office, her arms full of folders. "These are the preliminary ideas for the new product line," she said, placing them on his desk. Daniel flipped through the pages, impressed by the creativity and innovation on display. "The team's outdone themselves," he remarked. "Let's move forward with the top 3 concepts and start preparing for the investor summit." Mia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're different lately, more grounded." Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. "I've had a lot to learn these past months, but I think I'm finally starting to understand what matters." Mia's smile widened. "It shows, and I think the team feels it too." That evening, Daniel attended a charity gala at the suggestion of Evelyn, the consultant he had met weeks earlier. The event was hosted at a stunning downtown venue, the space filled with an eclectic mix of industry leaders, philanthropists, and creatives. As Daniel moved through the crowd, he found himself enjoying the conversations more than he expected. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't there to network or close a deal. He was simply present, engaging with people on a human level. When he spotted Evelyn across the room, she was deep in conversation with a small group, her laughter carrying easily over the noise of the crowd. Daniel waited for a moment before approaching, catching her attention with a subtle nod. "Daniel," Evelyn greeted warmly. "I was hoping you'd make it." "Wouldn't miss it," he replied. They fell into an easy conversation, discussing everything from the charity's mission to their shared thoughts on leadership. Evelyn's insights were sharp, her perspective refreshing as she challenged Daniel to think differently about his approach to balance and growth. "You've come a long way," she said, her tone thoughtful. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself. You're not just focused on fixing things anymore. You're building something new." Daniel nodded, her words resonating deeply. "That's the goal. It hasn't been easy, but I've learned a lot." "Well, keep going," Evelyn said with a smile. "I think you're just getting started." As the gala wound down, Daniel found himself standing on the balcony overlooking the city. Evelyn joined him, the crisp night air a welcome reprieve from the warmth of the event. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Evelyn asked, her voice quiet but curious. Daniel considered the question, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "I used to think it was all about the next goal, the next milestone. But now, I think it's about the journey, the people you meet, the lessons you learn. That's what shapes what's next." Evelyn nodded, a thoughtful smile on her face. "That's a good answer." When Daniel returned home that night, the penthouse felt alive in a way it hadn't for months. It wasn't the space that had changed, it was him. The echoes of betrayal that had once haunted the halls were now replaced by a quiet sense of peace and possibility. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the city stretching out before him. His thoughts drifted to Evelyn, to the conversations they'd shared, and to the sense of connection he hadn't felt in a long time. As the night deepened, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future no longer defined by the past, but shaped by the choices he was making now. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Daniel's penthouse, casting long, golden shadows across the sleek, minimalist interior. For once, Daniel allowed himself a slow start to the day. With a cup of coffee in hand, he stood by the window, gazing out at the city that had once felt like a battleground. Today, it felt different, like a place full of potential. His thoughts drifted to the previous night, to the gala, and to Evelyn. Their conversations had lingered in his mind, her words resonating more deeply than he expected. It wasn't just her insight that had struck him. It was the ease of their connection, the way her presence felt refreshing and uncomplicated. For the first time in months, Daniel considered the possibility of letting someone new into his life. Later that day, Daniel met with Mia to review the final preparations for the upcoming Investor Summit. The office buzzed with energy, the team operating like a well-oiled machine under Daniel's steady leadership. "Everything's on track," Mia said, scrolling through her tablet as they walked down the hall. "The investors are excited. The presentations look solid, and the team is ready." "Good," Daniel replied, nodding. "This summit is more than just numbers. It's a chance to show everyone what we've built and where we're headed." Mia smiled. "They'll see it. You've turned this company around, Daniel. And it's not just the investors who've noticed. The team feels it too." Daniel glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's not just me, Mia. We did this together." That evening, Daniel found himself drafting a message to Evelyn. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen before finally typing. "I wanted to thank you again for last night. Your perspective really stuck with me. Let's grab coffee soon. I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on leadership." The reply came quickly. "I'd like that. Let me know when works for you." A faint smile crossed Daniel's face as he set his phone down. The exchange was simple, but it felt like a step forward, one he hadn't expected to take so soon. In the days leading up to the summit, Daniel focused on fine-tuning every detail of the presentations. The company's progress over the past months was undeniable, and Daniel was determined to showcase not just their resilience, but their vision for the future. The night before the event, Daniel stood in the boardroom, reviewing his speech one last time. The room was empty, the lights dimmed, but his voice carried confidently as he rehearsed. "You've got this," Mia said from the doorway, startling him. Daniel turned, a sheepish smile on his face. Didn't realize I had an audience. Mia stepped inside, leaning against the table. You don't need to rehearse, Daniel. You're at your best when you speak from the heart. Just be yourself. Daniel nodded, her words a reminder of how far he had come. Thanks, Mia. I'll keep that in mind. The summit was a resounding success. Investors left impressed, their confidence in the company reaffirmed. The team celebrated that evening with a small gathering at a local restaurant, the mood light and filled with laughter. Amid the celebration, Daniel stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The cool night air was a welcome reprieve, and he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Evelyn. Congrats on the summit. I heard it was a huge success. Still up for that coffee? Daniel replied without hesitation. Absolutely. Let's make it happen this week. As Daniel returned to the group inside, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in a long time. The past months had tested him in ways he couldn't have imagined, but they had also shaped him into someone stronger, more deliberate, and ready to embrace new possibilities. For the first time, the future felt like something he could look forward to, not just professionally but personally as well. The sun was setting over the city as Daniel walked into the quiet cafe where he and Evelyn had agreed to meet. The warm tones of the space and the faint hum of conversations created a sense of calm that immediately put him at ease. He spotted Evelyn at a corner table, her notebook open in front of her as she sipped her coffee. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. Daniel, good to see you. You too, he replied, sitting across from her. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from the summit's success to Evelyn's latest projects. Daniel found himself drawn not just to her insights, but to the warmth and authenticity she brought to their exchange. You've come a long way, Evelyn said at one point, her tone thoughtful. It's clear that you're not just leading a company. You're leading yourself. Daniel smiled, her words resonating deeply. It hasn't been easy, but I've learned a lot. About resilience, about trust, and about letting go of what doesn't serve me anymore. Evelyn nodded, her gaze steady. That's a hard lesson, but it's one that makes all the difference. As the evening wore on, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: lightness. The weight of the past months, the betrayals, the doubts, all of it seemed to fade in the presence of someone who saw him for who he was now, not who he had been. When they parted ways, Daniel walked home with a renewed sense of hope. Evelyn hadn't just been a source of insight. She had reminded him of the possibilities that lay ahead. The following week, Daniel returned to the design floor to check on the progress of the prototype Kara had presented. The team's enthusiasm was infectious as they showed him the latest iterations, their confidence growing under his encouragement. This is fantastic work, Daniel said, addressing the group. Let's finalize the details and get this ready for production. Kara beamed, her pride evident. Thank you, Mr. Carter. We couldn't have done this without your support. Daniel smiled, the sincerity of her words hitting him in a way that felt both humbling and gratifying. Moments like these reminded him of the impact he could have, not just as a leader, but as someone who believed in the people around him. That evening, Daniel hosted a small gathering at the penthouse to celebrate the company's recent successes. The space, once a reminder of loss and betrayal, now felt alive with laughter and connection. Mia was the first to raise a toast, her glass held high as she addressed the group. To Daniel, she said, her voice warm, for showing us what true leadership looks like, and for reminding us that even in the face of challenges, there's always a way forward. The group erupted in applause, and Daniel felt a swell of emotion as he raised his own glass. Thank you, he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. This journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. And that's because of all of you. Here's to the future we're building together. As the night wound down and the last of the guests departed, Daniel stood by the window, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The city stretched out before him, vibrant, and full of life. His phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn. "I had a great time at coffee. Let's do it again soon." Daniel replied without hesitation, "Absolutely. Looking forward to it." As he set the phone down, he realized something profound. The pain of the past no longer defined him. It had shaped him, yes, but it no longer held power over him. He was free to move forward, not just professionally, but personally. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt whole. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.